All right, let's dive into something pretty dark today. The minds of killers, convicted killers. You guys sent us a bunch of videos, like 10 disturbing interviews with killers, and some really wild ones, like serial killer, Melvin Rees, the sex beast, and the shoe fetish slayer. It's intense stuff, but we're not here for just the thrills. We really want to try to understand what goes on in these people's minds and what we can learn from their stories, right? And luckily, we have an expert with us to help us make sense of all of it.
It is fascinating how these interviews, even years later, can give us a look into their motives and psyche.
Yeah, absolutely. So where do we even start? There's so many infamous figures, each one more disturbing than the last. Let's start with John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. The way he just deflects blame, with his eerie calmness, is just bone-chilling. Psychologically, what's happening there?
Well, Gacy's a classic example of compartmentalization. He was able to completely separate his public image as the, friendly, outgoing guy in the community from the horrific things he was doing in private. And you can really see that disconnect in his interviews, where he keeps up this facade of innocence even when he's talking about the deaths of 33 young men.
That's what makes that moment with the rope trick, the same one he used on his victims, so unsettling. It's like he's completely detached from reality.
Yeah, that casual demonstration with just a shoelace, it's a chilling example of how a sociopath can just completely disassociate themselves from the emotional weight of their crimes. It's like he's just doing a magic trick and totally ignoring the horrific context.
Speaking of chilling, let's talk about Ted Bundy. Those early jailhouse interviews, he almost seems charming and relaxed, making eye contact. But then closer to his execution, there's fear, blame shifting. Talk about violent pornography as a root cause. It's a huge personality shift. What could explain such a drastic change?
Well, Bundy's transformation is really interesting psychologically. That initial charm offensive was a calculated manipulation tactic. He was playing to the cameras, trying to control the story. But as his execution got closer and the reality of his situation sank in, that persona crumbled, and you could see the fear and desperation underneath.
So it was all about control. Even facing death, he was still trying to manipulate the situation, to blame anything or anyone else. It's so different from someone like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. He seemed to embrace his evil. There's this coiled rage, a fascination with Satanism. And even when describing his brutal crimes, there's an unsettling calmness. It's like he wants us to be afraid.
You're right. Ramirez embodies a totally different criminal personality. He wasn't trying to hide his darkness, he embraced it. His interviews are almost theatrical, full of pronouncements of his evil nature. This points to a deep-seated need for notoriety and a desire to instill fear in people.
Yeah, his quote, "Yes, I am, not 100%, but I am evil," chills me to the bone every time I hear it. It's like he's defining himself through violence.
Exactly. For Ramirez, evil wasn't just something he did, it was who he was. He saw himself as an agent of darkness and used his interviews to project that image to the world.
Now let's look at Edmund Kemper. Brilliant mind, articulate, but a brutal killer. It's that jarring contrast that makes him so fascinating. He describes his actions in this really matter-of-fact way, but then he'll throw in a joke, like about picking up hitchhikers. It's almost like he's toying with the interviewer and with us, the audience.
Kemper's case is really complex. His high intellect allowed him to analyze his crimes with a detached precision that is both disturbing and intriguing. That dark humor he uses could be a defense mechanism, a way to distance himself from the gravity of his actions. Or, like you said, it could be another way to manipulate, to control the narrative and make himself seem relatable, maybe even likable.
I remember that scene in the documentary where he puts on glasses and asks the camera if they would get in the car with him. Talk about chilling.
Yeah, it highlights his manipulative nature, right? He's playing with our perceptions, showing how easy it is to be fooled by appearances. He's making us confront our own vulnerabilities, our own judgments.
It's terrifying. And then there's Jeffrey Dahmer. The contrast here is really stark. Dahmer is quiet, almost remorseful as he recounts these horrifying acts. The lack of rage almost makes it more disturbing, especially when he reveals his attempts to create living zombies from his victims. What drives a person to that kind of depravity?
Dahmer's case is so disturbing because his motivations seem to come from this desperate need for control and a really warped sense of love. The living zombies thing speaks to wanting to possess his victims completely, stripping them of their will, making them extensions of himself. The lack of rage could suggest a deep sense of shame or a calculated attempt to appear more sympathetic. It's a really complex psychological puzzle.
It's like he wanted companionship, but on his own twisted terms. Then there's Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. The sheer number of victims is staggering. But he describes his crimes with this calmness, this lack of remorse. It's bone-chilling. He even talks about how showing a picture of his son helped him gain the trust of his victims. Unbelievable.
Ridgway's case is a reminder that seemingly ordinary people can have these monstrous impulses. His descriptions, coupled with his lack of remorse, suggest a huge disconnect from the human cost of his actions.
And that detail about using his son's picture, that's just another level of depravity. It shows how easily he could exploit even the most sacred parts of his life to get what he wanted.
It's a chilling example of how a psychopath can manipulate and exploit others with absolutely no sense of guilt or empathy.
Let's talk about Charles Manson. His interviews are a whirlwind of contradictions, violent outbursts, attempts to downplay his role as a leader, and then this bizarre talk about being from another dimension because he didn't have parents. What do we make of all that?
Manson is a fascinating study in charisma and manipulation. He had this incredible power over his followers, leading them to commit horrific acts. His erratic behavior in interviews could be a genuine reflection of his mental state, or it could be another way to manipulate, to confuse people and make them curious.
His pronouncements about being from another dimension, along with denying leadership, create this image of someone who both wants and rejects responsibility. It's a complex dance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Manson's persona is this mix of charisma, madness, and a distorted sense of self-importance. His interviews offer a glimpse into a mind that was both brilliant and very disturbed.
And then there's Otis Toole. His interviews are some of the most unsettling. The bursts of laughter, those chilling smiles, and the explicit descriptions of his crimes. It's almost too much. Is it genuine amusement or something more sinister?
Toole's case is a stark example of how mental illness and criminality can intertwine to create a truly disturbing personality. The laughter and smiles while talking about his crimes, that could be a sign of mental instability. Or it could be on purpose, to shock and unsettle the interviewer. It's a disturbing disconnect between his behavior and the gravity of his actions.
It's like he's trying to control the emotional dynamic, keep us off balance.
You got it. He's taking something horrific and trying to reframe it, using laughter and smiles as a shield against the weight of what he did.
It's terrifying to think that someone could find those acts amusing. It makes you question what it means to be human.
It does challenge our understanding of good and evil, sanity and insanity. But by studying these cases, by really trying to understand these individuals, we can gain insights into the darker parts of human nature and hopefully find ways to prevent these horrors from happening again.
You mentioned the importance of these interviews for law enforcement. Can you elaborate on that? What can investigators actually learn from talking to these people?
Well, interviewing serial killers, even though it can be disturbing, can be a valuable tool for law enforcement. It lets investigators gather information about the motives, methods, and psychological profiles of these offenders. That can be helpful in investigations and maybe even help prevent future crimes.
So it's not just about understanding that one person, but also about seeing patterns and figuring out how to protect potential victims.
Exactly. By studying the past, we can be better prepared for the future. And sometimes these interviews reveal connections or insights that we might otherwise miss. For example, the UK has their own version of Hannibal Lecter, a real-life guy named Robert Maudsley.
Wait, you mean like the character from Silence of the Lambs?
Yeah.
What makes this case similar?
Maudsley's crimes were so horrific that he's in solitary confinement, isolated in a specially designed cell, much like Hannibal Lecter. His case shows the extremes of human depravity and the challenges the justice system faces when dealing with these dangerous individuals.
It's a sobering reminder that the line between fiction and reality can be pretty thin. Speaking of disturbing, there's Bill Suff. This guy preyed on prostitutes in Riverside, California, and his crimes were so methodical and showed a clear desire for power and control. The way he posed his victims, the escalating violence, it's textbook sadism.
Suff's case is interesting because it really highlights the role of power and control in serial killing. That meticulous posing of the victims suggests a very deep need to dominate and exert absolute authority, even over their lifeless bodies.
And the fact that his wife tried to warn his supervisor about his behavior and was dismissed just adds another layer of tragedy. It's a reminder that even the most obvious signs can be ignored.
It's a pattern we see in a lot of these cases, missed opportunities to intervene to stop these individuals before their fantasies become violent actions.
Then there's Aileen Wuornos, one of the few female serial killers. She claims self-defense in the murders of several men. Her traumatic past, the claims of innocence, and accusations of government torture, it's a complicated case, to say the least.
Wuornos' case reminds us that the path to becoming a serial killer is often paved with trauma and abuse. Her story raises questions about how societal failures impact individuals and the complexity of mental illness. It's also a case where gender stereotypes come into play, as female serial killers are often viewed differently from men.
Her accusations about the government torturing her with sonic sounds are strange, though.
It's important to remember that people who've experienced a lot of trauma can develop coping mechanisms or beliefs that affect how they see reality. We can't just dismiss those claims, but we do need to look at them in the context of her psychological history and all the evidence.
Let's move on to Wesley Allen Dodd, who targeted young boys. His diary entries, where he details his meticulous planning, along with his admission that he enjoyed killing, are chilling. What can we learn from his case about how predatory these individuals are?
Dodd's case is a horrifying example of how calculated and predatory some serial killers can be. His diaries are a disturbing look into the mind of a predator. They show his distorted thinking and the careful planning he put into his crimes. It's a stark reminder that these individuals often act with a frightening level of premeditation.
Then there's Ted Bundy again. First, he denies everything, then confesses right before his execution. It's like he was playing games with the justice system.
Bundy is a classic narcissist, someone who manipulated and deceived people for years. His confession, even though it provided some closure, didn't lessen the horror of his crimes or the pain he caused his victims' families.
His charm and intelligence actually make his crimes more disturbing. It's like he used his charisma as a weapon.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He used those qualities to gain his victims' trust, to lure them in. It's a reminder that evil can wear many faces and that we can't always trust appearances.
And finally, we have Kenneth Douglas, the morgue worker who sexually violated over 100 corpses. It's infuriating that his wife tried to warn the authorities and they ignored her. How could such a betrayal of trust happen?
Douglas's case is a shocking example of the abuse of power and the violation of the deceased. It raises serious questions about accountability and the need for safeguards to prevent these kinds of acts. The authorities ignoring his wife's concerns is a tragic example of how systems can fail and contribute to this kind of abuse.
And his supervisor's response, whatever happens on county time and on county property is county business. That's just outrageous.
It shows a total disregard for the dignity of the deceased and the feelings of their families. It highlights the dangers of bureaucracy and the need for more compassion and accountability in positions of authority.
It's crazy how someone in a position of trust could take advantage of that in such a horrific way.
Right.
And to make it even worse, this wasn't just some isolated thing. The case of David Steffen, who ended up wrongly convicted of sexual assault because what Douglas did, really shows the ripple effect of this depravity.
Steffen's case really highlights how the justice system can get it wrong and the devastating impact of wrongful convictions. It's a stark reminder that even with all the advancements in forensics, human mistakes and bad behavior can still lead to terrible injustices.
It's a lot to think about. We put our faith in these systems, and when they fail, the consequences can be life-changing. And speaking of complicated cases within the justice system, we have Douglas Perry, who later became Donna Perry. This was a gun fanatic who targeted sex workers, but also someone struggling with gender identity. Perry even claimed that transitioning was a way to control violent urges. How do we even begin to unravel that?
Perry's case brings up really complex issues about gender identity and criminal behavior. We have to approach it carefully and avoid jumping to conclusions or making generalizations. Some people have speculated that Perry's transition was an attempt to avoid responsibility for the murders, but we can't ignore all the evidence and just lump transgender individuals together with violence.
It reminds us that human behavior is often driven by so many different things, and it's rarely as straightforward as we might hope. Speaking of complex motivations, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Melvin Rees, the sex beast. He was a traveling musician, seemed harmless on the surface, but underneath he was a monster who terrorized and murdered families. Just left a trail of devastation in his wake.
Rees's case is really unsettling because of the careful planning and sheer brutality of his crimes. The discovery of that murder journal, with those detailed descriptions of his sadistic acts, really shows his depravity and his twisted perspective on the world.
What makes it even more interesting, and maybe even a little unsettling, is the involvement of Peter Hurkos, that famous psychic.
Hurkos' involvement in the Rees case shows this fascinating intersection of true crime and the paranormal. Even though some people dismissed his contributions as just for show, he actually provided some surprisingly accurate details about the killer and the crimes, adding another layer of intrigue to an already complicated and disturbing case.
It's like something out of a movie. He got Rees's appearance right, his posture, even picked out his old house. And what about the detail of Mildred Jackson missing a tooth? How could he have known that unless he had some kind of psychic link to the case?
While skeptics might say there were other explanations, like subtle clues he picked up on or prior knowledge of the case, the accuracy of some of his insights is still a topic of debate and speculation.
It definitely adds an air of mystery to the whole thing. But let's get back to the psychology of these killers. Edmund Kemper's story is particularly horrifying. He killed his grandparents, spent time in a mental institution, was released, and then went on a killing spree, targeting young women. How could the system fail so badly?
Kemper's case is a sad example of how the mental health system can fail. Despite all the warning signs and his history of violence, he was considered cured and let back into society. And we know the devastating consequences of that. It highlights how difficult it is to assess risk and the need for continuous monitoring and support for people with a history of violent behavior.
And the fact that he actually became friends with cops, hung out at their bar while committing these awful murders, it's mind-boggling. How could they not see what was going on?
It shows just how manipulative Kemper was. He managed to gain the trust of the very people who are supposed to be protecting society, all while he was secretly carrying out these horrible acts. It's a chilling example of how a charming persona can hide a really dark and dangerous side.
And then the ultimate betrayal, he killed his own mother and even decapitated her. It's hard to even grasp that level of brutality.
Killing his mother, someone he had a very troubled relationship with, was the culmination of his twisted fantasies and deep-seated rage. It's a horrific act that shows the depth of his psychological disturbance and the tragic consequences of unaddressed trauma.
It's like a nightmare you can't wake up from.
Yeah.
And sadly, these nightmares just keep happening in different ways. Take Jerry Brudos, the shoe fetish slayer. This guy was so fixated on women's shoes that he actually killed to satisfy his fetish.
Brudos's case really shows how powerful fetishes can be in driving deviant behavior. His obsession with shoes, which stemmed from a traumatic experience in his childhood, turned into a series of awful murders where he was trying to control and dehumanize his victims.
The details are really disturbing. He dresses victims like dolls, posed them for pictures, and even tried to create a living doll using electricity to reanimate a corpse.
Those actions show a deep need for control and a desire to turn his victims into objects that fit his obsession. It's a scary example of how something seemingly harmless like a fetish can become a path to violence and depravity.
And the most shocking thing, his wife was completely in the dark. She had absolutely no clue about her husband's double life. It reminds us that these individuals often live normal lives, hiding their dark urges from the people they're closest to.
That's something we see in many serial killer cases. They're often incredibly good at deception, able to separate different parts of their lives and maintain a normal facade while secretly committing these horrible acts.
It's a terrifying thought that someone you love, someone you share your life with, could be capable of such terrible things. And it brings us back to the question of why. What makes these people do these horrible things?
That's the big question, isn't it? There's no one answer, no easy explanation for where evil comes from. It's usually a mix of things: biological predispositions, trauma in childhood, mental illness, societal influences. They all come together to create this perfect storm of darkness.
So it's not just nature or nurture, it's both.
Exactly. It's a combination of factors that shapes these individuals and puts them on a destructive path.
What about these disturbing interviews? Do the killers get something out of them? Are they looking for redemption, notoriety, or something else altogether?
That's an interesting question. For some, it's a chance to relive their crimes, to enjoy the notoriety. They want the attention, the infamy. It feeds their egos and makes them feel powerful.
It's like a twisted performance for them. The cameras, the interviewers, they become a captive audience, hanging on to their every word.
Right. They become the stars of their own horror show. For others, it might be about trying to justify what they did, explaining their logic, even if that logic is messed up and disturbing. They might try to blame others, downplay their own responsibility, or even try to paint themselves as victims.
Like Ted Bundy blaming pornography.
Exactly. It's a way to distance themselves from the horror of what they did, to find some outside explanation for the darkness inside them.
It's all so disturbing, but I can't help but be drawn to it. It's like a car crash. You don't want to look, but you just can't look away.
There's a natural human curiosity about the macabre, about the darker parts of ourselves. These cases make us confront the uncomfortable reality that evil is real and that it can hide anywhere, even in the hearts of people who seem ordinary.
But what can we learn from all of this? Can we stop these horrors from happening again?
That's the ultimate goal, right? We may never fully understand what drives people to commit such atrocities, but we can certainly try to prevent them. Early intervention, addressing trauma and abuse when kids are young, and providing mental health support are crucial.
What about the role of the media? Do you think the way these cases are covered makes the problem worse?
It's a tough one. On one hand, media coverage can raise awareness and help catch these people. But on the other hand, sensationalized reporting can make these killers seem glamorous, which could inspire copycats. It's a tricky balance to strike.
So what should we do moving forward? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
I think the most important thing is to remember that even though evil is real, it's not unbeatable. We have to stay vigilant, learn the warning signs, and work together to build a safer world for everyone.
Well said. I hope this deep dive has provided some insight, some understanding of the minds of these monsters. It's been a chilling journey, but I think it was an important one to take.
I agree. Knowledge is power. And by understanding the darkest parts of human behavior, we can work towards a better future.
A big thanks to our expert for sharing your knowledge and expertise. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey into the abyss. Remember to stay informed, stay vigilant, and never stop questioning. Until next time. That's a lot to absorb for sure. But before we finish up, I want to go back to those YouTube videos you sent, specifically the one about the shoe fetish slayer, Jerry Brudos. There was that part about how he would dress his victims in lingerie and take pictures of them. What's the psychology behind that kind of, ritualistic behavior?
Yeah, that posing of victims often shows a need for control, a need to dominate and possess. It's like the killer is creating a scene, right? A scene that plays out their fantasies and reinforces their power over the victim, even after death.
That's what's so creepy, is like they're making their own world where they're in charge, and the victim is just a prop in their sick game.
Exactly. It's their inner world coming out, a world where empathy and compassion are totally gone, replaced with this cold need to control and manipulate.
And it's not just Brudos, right? We see that need for control in other cases too, like Bill Suff with his careful posing of victims. It's almost like they're trying to make some kind of, artistic statement out of something so awful.
That's a really chilling observation, and it shows how these individuals separate their actions from their regular lives. They might see their crimes as something totally different, maybe even finding some kind of twisted satisfaction in those ritualistic elements.
It's a scary thought, but it does help to understand what's going on in their minds. Thinking back to those videos, there's another one that really stuck with me, is the one about Kenneth Douglas, the guy who worked at the morgue and abused over 100 bodies. The scale of what he did is just unbelievable.
Yeah, Douglas's case is a horrible example of necrophilia. It raises so many questions about how someone could do that, especially to so many people. I mean, part of it might be opportunity, having access to the bodies.
Yeah.
But there's clearly a deep psychological problem there, too.
What I find especially disturbing is that his wife tried to warn his supervisor, but she was completely ignored. It's like nobody wanted to believe that someone could be capable of something so awful.
That's a problem we see a lot, unfortunately. People don't want to believe that someone they know, someone in a position of power, could do such things. There's this denial, this disbelief that allows them to keep abusing people without anyone stopping them.
It's a good reminder that we have to be aware, to notice those red flags, and to speak up when something seems off. But even when they get caught, when they're interviewed and studied, there's still this mystery about them. We can analyze their behavior, we can try to figure out their reasons, but there's always a part of them that remains hidden. A darkness that we may never truly understand.
That's the truth, isn't it? We can look into their psychology, take apart their actions and words, but at the core, there's this darkness that we can't quite grasp, a total lack of empathy that we might never fully get.
It's a humbling thought, a reminder that there are limits to what we can know about the human mind, especially when it comes to those dark places. And maybe that's the most important thing to take away from all of this. We can study these cases, we can try to make sense of the senseless, but in the end, we have to accept that evil exists, that there's a capacity for darkness within all of us.
You're absolutely right. It's not a pleasant thought, but it's a necessary one. By recognizing that potential for darkness, we can be more careful about guarding against it, both in ourselves and in others. We can work towards building a world where empathy and compassion are stronger, where those bad seeds don't have a chance to grow.
That's a hopeful thought, a reminder that even with all this darkness, there's still a chance for good. I want to thank you so much for guiding us through this tough topic, for helping us understand the complexities of the criminal mind.
It was my pleasure. I believe that knowledge is power. And by understanding what drives these individuals, we can be better prepared to stop future tragedies from happening.
Well said. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the minds of convicted killers. It's been a difficult journey, but hopefully one that leaves you with a deeper understanding of the human capacity for both good and evil. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and don't ever forget the importance of empathy and compassion. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the world, even those dark corners.